We're really delighted to be hosting Elliott Ackerman again at P&P. He was here almost exactly 2 years ago for his first book, Green on Blue, which did very well and garnered great reviews as a powerful, lyrical, poignant novel set in Afghanistan. Elliott, as a number of you may already know, experienced the U.S. wars in Afghanistan and Iraq firsthand as both a Marine and a CIA officer, and was deployed multiple times. For the past several years, he has covered the fighting in Syria as a civilian for several publications. His new novel, Dark at the Crossing, is set on the border between Syria and Turkey, and begins with an Iraqi-American named Harris, who wants to cross into Syria to fight against Assad's regime. Harris has his own conflicted past. He earned his U.S. citizenship by assisting American forces during the Iraq War and feels no pride in that. Now he hopes to reinvent himself in a different war. But he runs into trouble early on, then meets up with a couple who are themselves refugees from Syria, a former revolutionary and his wife. She's very intent on going back, but her husband doesn't want to. And Harris is presented with some choices, not only about what to do, but who he really is. The book certainly is timely, given the ongoing war in Syria, but its themes also are timeless ones, about the costs of war, about restless searching, about causes and second chances. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Elliott Ackerman.
Thanks again. That was a very nice intro and a really excellent summary of the book. I might ask you to do that for me coming up.
We should say this is the world premiere.
Yeah. Yeah. And what a nice crowd. Somebody called the White House. Too soon? So I thought I'd just start out by reading, and this is the opening of the book. The morning he went off to his second war, Harris Abadi spent 20 minutes in the sauna of the Tujan Hotel. Cleaned by his sweat, he swaddled himself in a complimentary bathrobe, went up to his room, and took a long shower. Then he went back to sleep, waking naked on his bed an hour later. Downstairs for a late breakfast, he ate 3 buttered croissants with jam. The concierge found Harris in the large, empty dining room, its circular table set with fine crystal, as if waiting for a party that would never come. Leaning over Harris, the concierge grasped the lapels of his suit jacket, where he wore a pinned insignia of crossed gold keys. He asked Harris something in Turkish. Harris didn't speak Turkish and shrugged back, his mouth still full of flaky croissant. The concierge tried Arabic. "How has your stay been?" "Good, thank you," said Harris. "Business or pleasure?" "Business," answered Harris. There was no other reason to come to Antep, an industrial backwater along Turkey's southern border with Syria. The concierge looked at the stuffed hiking pack propped against a leg of Harris's chair. "Checking out, then?" Harris reached into a deep internal pocket on the pack, fishing around for his cash. He pulled out a mixed roll of Turkish lira, American dollars, and Syrian pounds. He held the wad beneath the table, counting it bill by bill. The concierge hovered above him. 200 a night, yes?" asked Harris, peeling 600 lira off his roll. The concierge nodded, eyeing Harris's dollars. "You're an American?" he asked. Harris handed over the money for 3 nights. "Here, 600. He felt the concierge taking a closer look at him, his pack, his desert suede combat boots. "I'd prefer you pay in dollars," said the concierge. As hard as he worked to become an American, Harris hated the way his new clothes and strong currency betrayed him abroad. He paid in dollars, and the concierge tucked the tight fold of 20s into his vest's front pocket. "Allow me to find you a cab." Harris nodded, then got up, went to the bathroom. leaving his heavy pack unattended in the opulent dining room. He didn't seem to care if everything was taken from him. So the protagonist of this novel is this fellow named Harris Abadi, who, as was mentioned, is kind of a man of two personalities and two identities. He is an Iraqi-American, so born in Iraq, but a naturalized U.S. citizen. And so when you meet him in this scene, kind of what the scene tries to convey is the banality of going back to war. And he is trying to get across the border in Antep, or Gaziantep as it's actually known, which has been a crossroads for lots of people who have been engaged in the Syrian civil war. And he wants to fight for reasons that are slowly revealed throughout the course of the novel. So a lot of the writing that I do, whether intentionally or non-intentionally, seems to circle a lot of these political themes, and that I'll be, doing journalism or engaged somehow in kind of these very complicated political events, and I'll often feel as though there's this need to try to distill them down to something that's a little bit more simplistic, a little bit more personal. And oftentimes I see that in my journalism. So I started going to southern Turkey sort of on a lark. A friend of mine, really an acquaintance at that point, I was working as a White House fellow, had come in, and he was introduced to me through a friend of my mother's, and he was at sort of a crossroads in his career. And he said to me, well, Elliott, I'm thinking about maybe working for the State Department, maybe going back to graduate school. And he had been living for 6 years in Afghanistan, working at the American University there. And we were talking about those options, and I spent some time working in government, and I was dissuading him from them, talking about how bored he would be potentially if he did this, and how he would be, don't go to grad school, you're going to waste your time. And at the end of it, he said, well, I have this one idea. Me and my roommate in Afghanistan, we both work at the American University. We've been saving money there because we make a lot of money. We're single guys in Kabul, and we've been thinking about starting basically a research organization on the Turkish border. I looked at him to do work on Syria. I looked at him and said, well, if you do that, I'm there. I'm coming. And so, unfortunately, 6 months later, he decided that he was going to do it, and I was on the hook to come. And so, when I came in, I started spending a lot of time with him. His name was Matt in Gaziantep on the Turkish-Syrian border. I started meeting a lot of these folks. Whether they were individuals who worked for NGOs, whether they were folks who are engaged either actively or passively in the Civil War or the Revolution. And one person in particular I met was a fellow named Abed, to whom the book is dedicated. And Abed was a Syrian revolutionary from Damascus, had been an activist in the early protests, and he was now working for Matt. And so one day I was sitting in the house/office that Matt was renting, and Abed came in that night. He'd been working all day, drove up, and so we were talking about his day, and he basically said to me, I was like, so, what were you up to? He said, well, Elliott, it's funny enough, and he sort of speaks with a kind of a lilting British accent. He used to work at the British consulate in Damascus. And he said, I was in a Chocolate refugee camp today, and I met this fellow who I really think you should meet. And I said to him, okay, Abed, who's the guy? And he said, well, he used to fight for Al-Qaeda in Iraq, but I think the two of you would really get along. And so, so I said, all right, sounds good. And we made the arrangements within a week, and Abed and I drove down, and I wrote a piece about this, but it was basically the two of us, me and this fellow, his name was Abu Hassar, decided to have lunch together. And it actually turned into a series of lunches that we had over probably almost 2 years. But at that lunch, sitting around the table, was me, a veteran of the Iraq War and Afghanistan, the Afghan wars, Abu Hassar, who had a very interesting personal story. He had been an insurgent commander running guns and fighters across the border from Syria into Iraq during the heyday of the Iraq War, had wound up thrown into Assad's prisons, and then at the outset of the revolution, when Assad released all the jihadis so they might come fight against him, because you look much better if you're fighting international jihadis than if you're fighting democratic activists, my friend Abu Hassar was released. So him, and then my friend Abed, who was a very urbane, Damascene, secular Syrian, And as the three of us would talk, you could very much see in all of our experiences the various positions of not only the Syrian civil war, but really kind of this existential crisis that has consumed not only the Middle East, but in some ways has consumed, U.S. foreign policy. And if anything, it became the event, at least for me, and I think I'd be safe to say this of the two other people, Abed and my friend Abu Hassar, it became really the defining event of our times. And so trying to look at that from different angles was something that I started to want to do, to endeavor to do in the story. And was how do I put together a narrative that really kind of encapsulates what this failed revolution became. So with that, I'd like to read kind of a short passage of the book. And this gets down to, as was noted, Harris, who you met in the opening section, shortly thereafter, he goes and he tries to cross the border. And he's, in effect, mugged at the border. And as he's lying there on the side of the road, trying to figure out what he's going to do, everything's been taken from him, including his American passport, he meets a fella named Amir. And Amir is from Aleppo, was an activist in the revolution's early days, and is living in Gaziantep with his wife. And what you come to learn is that he and his wife lost their daughter in Aleppo during the revolution. And the circumstances were such that their home while Amir was out grocery shopping, of all things, was basically blew up, struck by artillery rounds, and she was taken across the border to the hospital. They assume the daughter is dead, but when she came to, she kind of cannot accept this loss of her daughter. And so this is a description early on when Harris first walks into Amir's apartment. So Amir stood in front of the console, arms folded, gazing down his nose. He watched the BBC like a statue watches visitors in a museum. Clips from a YouTube video played. A man around 30, no older than Harris, stood on a road that ran through a field of wind-brushed high grass. He wore a camouflage rain jacket, similar in pattern to Harris's. Beneath the jacket, a bright red turtleneck crawled up to the man's chin. A ticker ran across the bottom of the television screen. Abu Sakar, commander of the Free Army's independent Omar al-Farouk Brigade. The man had videos on his mobile, explained Abu Sakar. He looked directly into the camera, but spoke past it. It showed him raping a mother and her 2 daughters. He stripped them naked while they begged him to stop in the name of God. Finally, he slaughtered them with a knife. What would you have done? The grainy video cut to a montage of propaganda. Abu Sakar now stood in the field of grass. He knelt on a red and white prayer rug, praying namaz, invoking the name of God. He walked through a town of narrow dirt lanes and rickety hovels, roofed with corrugated aluminum. The residents turned out to greet him. A waving grandmother blew him a kiss. He laughed. Something about the laugh set Amir off. You know about him, he asked, turning away from the television. Harris had followed the war closely. He knew about Abu Sakar, but he didn't say anything. This idiot commands a brigade, said Amir, switching from Arabic into his formal manner of English. You know what he did before? Harris shook his head. A day laborer, answered Amir, again looking down his nose toward the BBC. The revolution is now commanded by day laborers. A disclaimer flashed across the screen. The following content may be disturbing for some audiences. Another YouTube video played. This one heavily pixelated, a recording off a cheap cell phone. Abu Sakar wore the same camouflage jacket, but with a white turtleneck beneath. His Kalashnikov hung lazily by his side, as if the rifle had become too heavy for him. At his feet, a man's tangled corpse splayed against the wet earth. Abu Sakar stepped on the man's chest. He looked at the camera in the same far-off way as before. We'll eat your hearts and your livers, you soldiers of Bashar the dog. He unsheathed a knife from his belt. He worked at the body beneath his foot. Off-camera, a raucous voice cheered. It looks like you're carving him a Valentine's heart. When Abu Sakar finished, he gazed at the camera, raising his hand to his mouth. His lips closed around a wet mass, shiny with greasy blood. The BBC report returned to the other YouTube video. Abu Sakar again stood on the road, surrounded by high grass. The wet asphalt ran into the distance. He spoke in that direction. "Put yourself in my position," he said. "They slaughtered my brothers. They murdered my uncle and aunt. All this happened to me. I didn't want to do this. We have to terrify the enemy, humiliate them, just as they do to us. Now they won't dare be wherever Abu Sakar is." The wind blew, parting the high grass. Abu Sakar faced back toward the camera, saying nothing. Then he raised his hand and made a V sign with his index and middle finger. V for victory or for peace. The revolution had brought this well-worn gesture back into fashion, though it meant two very different things, or perhaps the same thing. He walked into the road's distance, his Kalashnikov again hanging heavily at his side. The BBC's report finished. Amir muted the television, tossing the remote on the sofa. The commander of the Farouk Brigade, a heart-eating day laborer. So, one of the things that I kept observing in my interactions along the border, and particularly for those who'd been involved in the revolution in the early days, sort of the urbane activists who'd stood up to Assad, demanding democratic reforms, was you could be sitting there any given night, and we would go out to dinner, maybe a group of us. Often I might be the only American there, and and this was in 2013, 2014, and as we were looking over our menus and drinks were being ordered, you'd sit there and Syrian friends would basically saying, "Elliott, you don't understand. Like, the U.S. needs to intervene into Syria. We can still turn the tide in Syria. Like, the Free Syrian Army, there's still hope for them." And we would go on and on that conversation, and oftentimes I would just listen because I thought that was all I was really being asked to do. But you could see like that sense, that palpable sense, like that cause could not be abandoned by them, even though all evidence was to the contrary of how things were going inside of Syria. And then as the meal would go on, the evening would become a little bit more reflective, and almost to a person, friends of mine would look into their tea as it was ordered and say, "I regret the whole thing. I wish we'd never gone out in the streets. I wish we never protested. I wish Assad was still in place because I've destroyed my home and I can't go back to my home now." And so that conflict and that schism amongst these activists was actually what surprised me. Was it was something that I really recognized, in so much as I think for any war, the wreckage that is left in its wake makes it very difficult if you feel a certain semblance of pride in being engaged in that conflict. And I could see that conflict amongst many of these Syrian activists. And then furthermore, to take it just to another step, is when I thought about my own experience. It was, well, I went off to war in 2003, 2004, and it seems naive to say it now, but in those early days, and among the many things that war was about, one of the things it was nominally about was trying to bring democracy to parts of the world that had never known it before. And I would say that very quickly fell by the wayside. But if that was the ideology we went to war with, you could say that, guys of my generation, we were kind of ideologically dispossessed. It was taken away from us. And then I would look at my Syrian friends and I would say, I recognize that type of ideological dispossession in you as well. And when I would pose this question to them, they would, sort of say, maybe I see your point. And they would often laugh at the irony that, well, what's the reason we lost? What's the reason that I lost, or our wars didn't go well, they're still going on? And what's the reason your revolution failed? If you looked at it, it was for basically autocratic regimes and militant Islam. And we always have to laugh and say, if you think about it in those terms, we are strangely veterans of the exact same war. One of the things, too, that scene gets at as well when Amir says, the revolution is now led by heart-eating day laborers, is the conflict, because so much of the Syrian diaspora now are the best educated Syrians, the ones who one might hope would try to reimagine what the future of the country would look like, and they have now left. And so for those people trapped on the border, there's sort of three places you could be. You can be inside Syria, which for so many of them is a death sentence. you could be, a refugee trying to just flee, start a new life in Europe and say, I'm never coming back. Or you can be stuck at the border. And so many people who are living at the border, they're not necessarily living at the border because they haven't figured out how to get to Europe or because they don't know how to get back to their homes inside Syria. They're sitting there because they kind of cannot accept the fact that they will never return or cannot face what going back to Syria means. And so sort of the tragedy is seeing this whole group of individuals who are caught in this liminal space. And at the same time, they're watching their revolution go sour. I was struck at one point, I was doing a piece for The Atlantic about Syria's war poets. And one of the fellows I was interviewing was telling me that for him it was very profound that now that he had left Syria and even that he was living in Turkey, he said, for the first time in my life, I can actually write what I want to write. And I can write the poetry and say exactly what I want to say. And he smiled about that. And he looked at me listlessly and said, but the problem with that is you can't have Syrian poetry without Syria. And I think that's the reality that continues to exist today. So with that, I'll go to read one last section of the book. So as the novel progresses, what you really see is the central conflict in it is that the protagonist, Harris, who wants to cross into Syria to fight for reasons that are sort of murky even to himself, but in some ways he's trying to reinvent himself inside of Syria. He meets this couple, Amir and Daphne, who've lost their daughter. And as I mentioned, Amir he was a revolutionary, but refuses to go back. He's like one of those individuals who says, I'm going to Europe, I'm done with the war, I'm going to cut my losses and leave. And Daphne, his wife, who's French-Syrian, just cannot accept the loss of the daughter and wants to return to Syria. And sort of, the daughter in the book kind of becomes a metaphor for the revolution itself. And the central question a lot of these characters are facing in the novel is, is it better to accept a lost cause, or is it better to continue to pursue that cause, as delusional as it might be? And that's what they're all wrestling with, and that conflict is what kind of ultimately drives the book to its conclusion. So this scene is right after Harris and Daphne has first met, and they're at their apartment, just the two of them, and Daphne is basically explaining to Harris why she believes her daughter is still alive. So Daphne barged back through the door. Under both her arms, she held spiral binders, composition notebooks, moleskin pads. She dumped them on the sofa bed in a worthless heap. Some of the journals leafed open. Scrawled across their pages in blue ink, her handwriting was pressed hard into each one. Daphne bent over and tidied up the mess, as if realizing she'd been careless with something of great value. Placing the journals in two neat stacks between her and Harris, she again sat with her legs tucked under her on the sofa bed. Then, more carefully, she folded back the journal's spines one by one, handing the open pages to Harris. They're lesson plans, she said, as Harris looked over the indecipherable French. From your kindergarten, he asked. No, she said. They're from after. After. When the revolution began, I was studying for my degree, but I wasn't really interested in my subject. I just invested so much time at the university, exams, papers, research. My life had a momentum to it, one I didn't care for. Then, as the war destroyed everything, we all learned to rebuild among the destruction. The first thing I built was the kindergarten for my daughter, Kifa. I didn't draw up any lesson plans then. I just began to teach with a few other mothers. To my surprise, I found more satisfaction in this modest pursuit than any other I'd taken on. War can be a blessing in this way. If you're trapped, its destruction can free you. It freed me to become my daughter's teacher. Then what are these lessons plans for? Asked Harris. Daphne flipped through the notebooks, tracing her fingers over the pages as if they were covered in braille. They are for Kifa, she said, as if it was obvious. Every day I keep track of the school she's missed and what I'll need to teach her. I saw the photo of her grave, Harris blurted. Daphne's eyes wandered back toward him. I came across it when I was changing my clothes in your room, he said. I'm sorry. As he apologized, he wasn't certain if he meant he was sorry for snooping through her things or for her loss. He allowed her to take his apology for either of its meanings, or for the two combined. Slowly, Daphne began to shake her head. No, my daughter is alive. She closed one journal and opened another. Pressed between its pages was the Polaroid. She held it by the tab on its bottom. I don't know whose grave this is, she said, looking at the photo and the journal stacked about her. You didn't believe that nonsense about Latia staying in Aleppo for her cats, did you? She stayed because she couldn't afford to leave. Amir paid for her to bring me this photo. This wasn't the first time. 2 months ago, one of our old neighbors came to Antep claiming the same about Kifa, but with no proof except rumors. Amir had paid for his journey too. My husband does this because he loves me, but he's lost hope for our daughter. What type of a marriage can we have when he's abandoned her? He wants me to do the same, so that I will leave with him. Whether you help me or not, I will never abandon my daughter. You said nothing to Latia? Asked Harris. She's suffered enough. Why make her feel guilty about a photograph? The journey across the border is dangerous. It's more dangerous to stay, replied Daphne. She spoke with clarity. Possessing one option unburdened her of choice. Harris recognized the freedom she found in this. Daphne gathered up her journals and returned them to her bedroom. Harris stood by the window, looking out toward Antep City Park. He thought of the sleeping bundles around the elms, the boy Daoud, Saeed. With such little control over their circumstances, their lives also contained but one option. They couldn't simplify themselves further. Harris wondered if he had reached that point of reduction. Thank you. And if anyone has any questions, I'm happy to take them. Yes.
First of all, I think you write beautifully, and I especially love how several of your phrases, for example, the peace and the victory sign, you give it the attention of saying it could be one thing, it could be the other, but it also could be both. I love that. So my big question is that the Syrian opposition at no time was monolithic. How do you deal with that in your novel? How does that come through in your personalities?
Well, I think the one way it comes through is in the scene I read. You see the schism amongst the Syrian opposition. Like, for instance, the character Amir is very much, again, this urbane Syrian who fought in the nonviolent protests early on in the Arab Spring, and what he has seen is this instance of Abu Sakar, which is actually based off of a real incident. And he laments that the revolution is now led by heart-eating day laborers. So that, we had come out in the early days, the creme de la creme of Syrian society who wanted to implement very liberal reforms, and now our intellectual revolution has just evolved into a war of attrition led by the uneducated who are only still there because they do not have the means to leave. And that's a very real schism. For many of the Syrians I met, very obviously, there's this desire to go back to Syria, not only because emotionally they want to go back, because also, to have credibility, you have to be back in Syria if you're part of the opposition. Obviously, it's a novel, so it's not going to be a cataloging of all the various opposition groups, but I was definitely wanting to get those themes across that even within the opposition, not all of them view one another the same way. And even amongst those Syrians who are sympathetic to the opposition, for instance, Daphne, Amir's wife, in the book you see, she's sort of ambivalent towards all sides. I think she has a line at one point where she says, I've seen everyone who's fighting and none are good. So that's how I tried to do it. Yes.
Could you make your way to that microphone?
First of all, I want to thank you for your service and your bravery.
Thank
Pretty
you.
amazing.
Thank you.
I have a very good friend. We were students together from Damascus, Syria. And when the revolution broke out, I called Muhammad and I said, "Gosh, you must be thrilled." And he said, "No, a disaster." And he read it from the beginning, and it sort of turned out to be a disaster. But where's it going, and where's it going to end? I mean, you've been there, you know a lot more about it than any of us. What are your own thoughts, and what are your thoughts about a lot of criticism of Obama and his ambivalence and waffling? What do you think is the right thing for us to do?
Sure. It's interesting for me to hear that, one of my Syrian friends who was an activist told me that his father was, furious, and it really divided their family because the older generations of Syria who had seen the senior Assad's crackdowns on any type of dissent really felt as though they knew what was coming in a way that the younger Syrians did not know. And so there was a lot of, I think many of the, those who were, probably in their 50s or 60s immediately knew what was going to be coming down the pike, and those who were in their 20s or 30s did not. I think it's difficult because I think what you're seeing in Syria is really part of existential crisis in the Middle East that includes Iraq and and now seems to be including parts of Turkey, and it's not only an existential crisis about what is going to be the future of the Middle East, but also an existential crisis about what is going to be the future of Islam and whether or not we're going to see more progressive strands take hold, hopefully, or more regressive strands of Islam take hold. And I don't think it's something that's going to be figured out anytime soon. I think with regards to President Obama, I think it's very difficult to be too critical of anyone who is making those types of decisions. And I say that regardless of party. I include George W. Bush in that because these are really tough decisions. And I remember saying to an old Marine buddy of mine, probably in 2012, the summer when we were talking about, really seriously talking about intervening, saying, if we go and they send the 1st Marine Division into Syria, I'm going to go put on my old Marine uniform, sort of Ronnie Kovic style, and walk down to the Capitol. This is absurd. These wars have to end. And then a couple of years later, watching how our inaction in Syria led to the rise of the Islamic State in Iraq, and how it's just spread, and the lack of U.S. influence now with the Russians and the Turks really asserting themselves in the region. I look back and say, that was probably, my instincts there were probably wrong. There was probably something we could have done that would have been a middle road. So it's very, very difficult. I don't know what the future holds there, and I don't think it's something that's going to get resolved anytime soon. Yes.
What did the Syrians that you encountered think of Americans and their lack of support? And how did that change throughout your time? And what do they think now?
Sure. Well, I think it is very difficult because the specter of the Iraq War looms very, very large in Syria. So I would often sit down with a Syrian activist or a Turk or whomever, and the first thing they would want to do would be lecture me about the Iraq War, which I of course enjoyed and would sit there and and listen to, and they had fair points. But then frequently in the same breath, it would be the Iraq War was horrible, an abomination, and look at you, you're not doing anything right on Syria. And whoa, 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 whoa. So you don't like us when we invade Iraq, but now you want us to invade Syria. I don't get this. Was it F. Scott Fitzgerald has the great quote where he says, the mark of a true genius is to be able to hold two conflicting thoughts in your mind at once and not go insane. And I was like, by this criteria, everyone around here is a genius. So, or superior intelligence is what I think he says. But it's not. But I think it's but at the same time, I think it's, it's reasonable in so much as, what happened. There were a lot of disastrous consequences in Iraq, obviously, and what's going on in Syria right now has no obvious solution, and people are suffering, and they're looking for anyone to help turn the situation around. And the only people they look to, still is, they look to the United States, and so far it's sort of been waiting for Godot, but that would often kind of be the response I got.
Do the Syrians that you know want a unitary Syrian state to survive? Do you think there's any chance that a unitary Syrian state can be resurrected, or is it's broken, it's done?
I think it's pretty difficult to see it, reemerge exactly how it had once emerged with the same borders. I think most of them weren't talking about necessarily what at least the ones I came across, that there would be, that the concern was what the borders necessarily looked at. I think the people who, were active with the revolution, there's a real visceral need for Bashar al-Assad to go, based off of everything that has happened. But then, one of the things when I was there, early on, and again, it almost seems, naive to say this now, but one of the first times I ever went down to the border, it was in a place called Kilis, and right across the border is this town called Azaz. And if you remember, Azaz was made famous because when John McCain went into Syria, he went into Azaz, and he went in because it was very easy to get in there. You sort of just hop over the border and hop right back. So we were standing down there, and there were columns of smoke coming up from Azaz. When we said, "What's going on?" We thought that the Free Army held Azaz, and it was liberated very, very early on, and Jabhat al-Nusra was fighting against the Free Army in Azaz that day. And everyone was scratching their heads saying, why is Jabhat al-Nusra, these Islamists, fighting against the Free Syrian Army? This doesn't make any sense. They're all rebels. And it was this, for the first time in 2013, it was this realization that, wait. There's this group of Islamists who really don't care about toppling Assad. They're trying to make their own country in Syria. And I say it's trite now because, we've all seen the rise of the Islamic State, and the Islamic State is not about toppling Bashar al-Assad. It's about that vision. So I think, there's those forces to contend with as well. But I don't know how it will end. I think whatever it ends, it will probably look different than it was before.
I have a question about writing this kind of fiction. I really liked your first book. I haven't read this one. And one of the reasons I like it is I'm a fiction reader. I get a lot of what I learn about tough situations through fiction. I don't read the big, thick books that I think I should, but I read fiction a lot, and well, I think.
You and me both.
So I guess what I want to ask you, in addition to this book, this is such a tough and tragic part of the world, and even larger than that. I think it just, it affects everything. And so I'm wondering about what, it was such a big subject, there had to be things you left out, and big themes that you left out. So I was curious about what you wrestled with in this whole big area. Like, did you, and I haven't read the book obviously, but did you talk a lot about Islamic State and the creation? Are you thinking that's a big area to talk about some more? What else is there you're thinking about writing in this area?
Sure. The books I've written, I haven't really set out to write books that are big, that if you read my book, you will understand. Like, if you read Green on Blue, my ambition was not that you will understand Afghanistan. Right. And the same with this book. I wouldn't expect someone to understand what's going on in Syria. For me, it's more that I will spend time in these environments, and there will sort of be these, I guess, at least for what to me seem like these existential questions about what's going on. And I will try to frame them in a story and make that somewhat to make that somewhat accessible to a reader. I'm always sort of looking for these emotional equivalencies, if that makes sense. So how do I make someone half a world away in the United States understand emotionally what I feel like I'm seeing going on with all of these Syrian activists who are stuck in Gaziantep, and how they're sort of wrestling with what is in effect this lost cause. And if you see it in the book, and in the book the way it really manifests that lost cause is this dysfunctional marriage that's going on with Amir and Daphne. And the two of them are trying to wrestle with the loss of their daughter, the loss of their relationship, and this idea, as I mentioned before, is it better to just sort of abandon that and get on with their lives, or to continue to pursue it, even though it's almost delusional to pursue it at that point. And to me, that is almost kind of what the emotional truth was that I was seeing play out. And so I sort of start from there as opposed to the facts on the ground. And oftentimes, I'm trying to actually be cautious to not put in too much of a cataloging of what's going on, because I sort of feel like it gets in the way from what the core is of the story.
I mean, I did read Green on Blue, and I thought that the relationship of the brothers and the families and soldiers was really a personal story, but that it also reflected larger or taught me more. So I like that about the book.
Thank you.
Okay.
Elliott, two questions. You talked about a middle road, but in your heart of hearts, do you think there is a middle road? And the second question is, you've lived in Istanbul, maybe still live there. Is there hope for Turkey?
Well, easy questions. I think one of the things, I was talking with some Turkish friends recently, specifically to Turkey, and maybe this applies to the first question, is that it was actually coming up with respect to Egypt. I was talking to a journalist who had just moved to Istanbul after being working in Cairo for a long time. And he was basically making the point that, in Egypt, before the revolution, life was sort of here, and there was this sort of spike of hope with the revolution, and now there's been the crackdown under Sisi, and life is back down to here. And people have accepted that. And the thing that in Turkey is different is that, and by life I mean sort of freedom, liberalism, all of that. Life had sort of been up here for a long, long time. Turkey was Europe. Turkey was great. When I first went there, I mean, it was incredibly, liberal. You could think you were in Paris. And then now Erdogan has really, really cracked down, and there's liberal, the freedoms that people have come down to here. And all the Turks I talk to say it's unsustainable. Like something's going to give. That they're just not going to keep on like that. Now, does that make you optimistic? Because obviously it can give in really horrible ways. Many of the Turks I know who are Erdogan's greatest detractors say the thing they fear most is that someone will assassinate him because of what would come in that type of assassination's wake in terms of the power grab. So I think there's hope for Turkey. I think there's hope for Turkey because, you have, a Turkish society that is not going to accept this in the long term. But do I think that whatever that reform Turkey outside of Erdogan comes easily? No, I think Turkey's probably in for some, very tough days ahead.
Just, Elliott, just to build on the earlier question about the Syrian war being such a broad topic, given that it is, you still went and created a protagonist that's an Iraqi-American, bringing in echoes and images of the Iraq war in your story here, and I just wondered about your choice of creating that protagonist.
Yeah, I sort of, he's kind of the center of gravity that these other characters are orbiting around, and I say he's a man kind of two identities, and he's someone who you see sort of a lighter side of him and a darker side of him. The lighter side of him is the one that goes to Syria because, as he says in the book, he wants to fight for an irrefutable cause. He wants to do something that he feels is noble because he felt what he did in Iraq, working with the Americans, wasn't noble. And he's sort of this idealist. But he's also very, but he also kind of has this darkness to him. And so I was very interested in that, war can really be two things. It can be something that is filled with lots of idealism, but can also and is redemptive in its way. I mean, people often will go to war for redemption, or it can be something that's very nihilistic. And strangely, kind of thinking about Harris and his journey, like when you see him at the Tujan Hotel, I was probably 2.5 years ago reading Anna Karenina, and if spoiler alert, sorry if anyone, I don't want to kill your Anna Karenina sales, but at the end of the book. Vronsky, Count Vronsky, who's Anna's lover, Anna has thrown herself in front of the train and is dead. And the last you see of Count Vronsky, who had a military career, given it up for her, is you see him on a train, or he's actually reported to have been seen on a train heading to the Caucasus to go fight in the war. And so, I don't know, even reading that passage, I don't know, it seemed like incredibly sad to me. But it's, why did he go to war? Did he go there to destroy himself, or did he go there to redeem himself? And that's sort of the question with Harris. Is he going to destroy himself, or is he going to redeem himself? And that kind of holds all through the book until you get to the climax.
I mean, do you know of Iraqi-Americans that have gone to Syria?
I don't know personally Arab Americans who've gone to fight in Syria. I know there are Arab Americans who've gone to fight in Syria, but I haven't met any. Well, I think we have time for one more question, and I told that my daughter and son that the most important question is the last question, so they get to ask it. Okay, do you have a question, Ethan? What's your question? No. Yeah, okay. That's it. Thank you all for coming out tonight.
Ghostbusters exist.
Okay. Thank you very much.